I thought I would make a change, and once in a while I will make a video without a talking head bobbing about in front of the camera, so you get to look at my feet instead. This video is about accountability and omniscience and commerce and the Nazis and versus, and by comparison, the type of physics we possess here in the West that is different than what the Nazis possessed during the period of Nazi Germany and the buildup of Nazism in Nazi Germany prior to World War II. In their physics, they were not hampered by commerce. So their physics was given free rein because they worshipped power. They did not worship profit. We exercise a lot of power in this world of ours, but it's not the bottom line. Sorry. The bottom line is profit, even though there are many who do worship power and play all kinds of games, but it's the measure, the yardstick is usually who do you know, how influential are they, what kind of reputation do they have, and also money. How much do you got? So the physics that we have is geared to commerce. It caters to commerce. It's not just merely, will it make a profit? For instance, the pharmaceutical industry, they can't push or promote towards the American medical establishment the use of cayenne pepper as a wonder drug, because it's not a drug, it's an herb. And nobody can make money off of it, nobody can patent it, and so they don't promote it. Cayenne pepper is very useful for a lot of different ailments as a general tonic, of all things, to ensure the person doesn't crap out and die on you for lack of motivation of the will to live on the part of the body. Cayenne pepper provides that motivation. A little kick in the pants, a little kick in the seat of the pants, depending on how much of the stuff you take. So there's no incentive because there's no profit. But there's also this problem of accountability. It's a problem because in the real world, Mother Nature takes care of it. It's not our job to take care of that. And Mother Nature is omniscient. She knows everything about everyone and what everyone has done. And so she's equipped to make an accounting, while we are not. Yet we have a justice system, don't we? And we have commerce, which is the same thing. And accounting, accountability. What did you do? Is it approved of? Were you punished for doing something wrong? Or were you rewarded for doing something right? Or in many cases, people will say, well, I did something right, but I was never rewarded. Or I did something right and I was punished instead. So accountability doesn't exactly work along moral lines. And yet, regardless of the correctness or the fallibility of our accountability or accounting procedures, we still require it nonetheless. Despite our lack of omniscience and despite our consistency over what kind of rules do we apply to process accounting, to make an accounting. We don't have a consistency of rules at all. So it's very confusing and perplexing. But the biggest problem is lack of omniscience. So we're doing something we don't need to do and we shouldn't be doing because we can't even do it properly. If we had omniscience, we probably would be more consistent or justifiable in how we do our accounting. But we're not. Well, the physics of Nazi Germany did not have to take an accounting because energy is free. It's expandable. It's like breathing. It's like a bellows. It inhales, it exhales. It increases, it decreases, and yet it does so without a cost to place. See, we still are big believers in property. And property means land. It means real estate. I got a big eye-opener the other night when I was watching Gone with the Wind. I never watched the whole movie, or if I did as a child, I didn't really understand it. But now, I really got a lot out of it that I never would have gotten before. One of the things that blew me away was carpetbaggers. I didn't know what they were. I thought they just came with a carpet, and that was their luggage. I didn't know that they were real estate owners who wanted to collect on the property tax of the plantations they now owned after the war was over. Nobody sold it to them except probably the northern, government, the national government sold it to them, but be that as it may, the prior owner did not sell the property to them. They just acquired rights to it. And because the South lost the war, this was the incentive to send northern businessmen into the area at the cost of the South, because Scarlett O'Hara can't come up with the $300 for the property tax on Terra, their property. They're barely making a living with food and whatnot, barely getting by, trying to rebuild their destroyed home, and yet they now have to pay property tax, and they're going to face eviction if they don't come up with the $300. And the carpetbagger doesn't care, except, I'll exercise a little clemency and extend the due date a little bit, but you still got to pay. And he thinks he's giving them a privilege, it's a privilege. He's giving them a little grace, and she's going, "You're not giving me anything. Get off my property. I'm going to shoot you." So this was an eye-opener for me, because I had no idea that real estate and property tax was instituted during the Reconstruction immediately after the Civil War. That far back in our history, I had no idea. I thought it was a lot more recent than that. Well, it was an eye-opener because it showed how ridiculous it was that this guy's coming in who has no moral right to the property. He didn't work the land. He didn't do anything to acquire the land. He just took advantage of them because they lost the war. Now, property now has taken on a characteristic definition in our minds as being something more than just something physical. We actually tend to tie it to the earth of all things. And it's kind of interesting because when we look at celestial scales or even atomic scales, Zeno's paradox is not a paradox. We're the paradox that we don't get it. Zeno's paradox is not a paradox, it is a fact that there is no limit to scalability of the physical universe. There are no limits. This is probably why the Flat Earth Society line of reasoning is not necessarily fallible automatically. Yet, because it specifies a dimensionality to space, it's already at fault right there. Any dimensionality to space is fallible because space is not concrete. Space is abstract. And it's abstract because it's an abstract potentiality of what could be manifest as concrete if you choose to do so. That's why pretty much anything you can imagine, if you can imagine it, you can probably manifest it. Make it concrete, and then it'll be real for you or whoever you share it with. But the abstract nature of space allows for all these possibilities because it's defined with the use of mathematics and geometry and all those things related to mathematics as a potentiality, a potential definition of what you can manifest. So there's a lot of wiggle room because space is not concrete. So to say that it's a flat, one dimension, well, flat is actually two dimensions. To say that it's two dimensions is already erroneous on its face. Pun intended, face, right? Surface of the face. A surface, a flat surface, or a curved surface for that matter, whatever. It's already erroneous on its face because they're alluding some kind of concrete nature, some limitation to space, which space does not possess. And because it's an abstraction, I didn't get this until now that I think of it, there can't be any limit, can there? Only if space were a concrete reality could we claim, I have a bad back, so no position I sit in is comfortable. Only because we claim we presume that space is concrete, do we impose a false notion that space has limits of scale, physical scale, size. There's only so big, and then you hit the limit. Well, that's as bad as the flat Earth and you fall off the edge. It's really no different when you think about it. So how can there be a limit to size? We might as well be flat Earth people and believe you can fall off the edge if you go far enough. I mean, good grief, we're really no better. So why are we arguing with the flat Earth people if we're no different than they are? If we both agree on the concrete presumption of space. It's amazing. When I think it through, it's truly amazing. So, space is an abstraction, and thus it has no limits of scale. It cannot, because it's abstract. And thus, energy does not come from somewhere and go to somewhere else ultimately. When we say it moves from place to place, Eric Dollar does a really gymnastic feat. He says the energy entering into a capacitor is not the same energy that exits that capacitor. Now, he didn't say that energy in did not equal energy out. He could have be implying that possibility, because you can interpret what he said any which way you want to when it comes to quantity in versus quantity out. All he's saying is the energy going in is not the same energy coming out, which means you've got me, let's say, entering a building, an empty building, and then someone else exiting. And you have to wonder, wait a minute, wasn't the building empty before I entered? Then where'd this other guy come from? Well, that's what he's implying. Which could then imply that energy in may not equal energy out. But that's a minor problem. The kink in the canvas here is that no two same people exit and enter an electronic component. No two electrons enter and then exit a component. Oh, well, but yeah, there are other electrons in there. Well, you're bypassing the issue when you're being a politician when you do that. Because that's not this statement. The statement is energy in is not the same energy as the energy that comes out, meaning the identity is not the same. We're not even dealing with the quantity yet. The identity alone is not the same. If you could label an electron with a name, oh, this is Kyle. Electron, this electron's name is Kyle, and Kyle enters the capacitor, but Robert exits out the other side. And Robert was not in the capacitor before Kyle entered it. And now that Kyle entered the capacitor and Robert left, where did Kyle go? He's nowhere to be found inside the capacitor. What? What did he do? Disappear? But energy cannot be created or destroyed. What if it changes identity? And in the course of changing identity, does it have to be the same amount? See, in other words, it doesn't come from a place. We got to get away from this. Sure, you've got energy inside an atom, maybe. Or do you? Now this is very important. This is crucial. Because we have electrical reactance formulas. And nobody bothers to think through the consequences of those formulas. They never act on energy directly, but they always have a consequence because they only act directly on frequency. And also capacitance and inductance, but that's the property of the electronic component, not the property of the energy necessarily. in terms of its quantity. Although it does imply positive resistance versus negative resistance, which would have a direct impact on the quantity of the energy. So that part is true. But what I like to do is focus on the frequency, because frequency, the definition of frequency is potential energy. It's not kinetic. Yet potential energy of frequency does have a direct consequence as a causative factor, as a causation, to bring into effect the amplitude of the energy, the power, as a consequence of frequency. In other words, they are directly related. Unlike Ohm's law, frequency and power are directly related. So when the frequency goes up, the power goes up. Now people will say that's not true. They're saying, no, you're not saying this right. When the frequency goes up, the power goes down. Not when you're dealing with reactance, not when you're dealing with negative power factor. Negative unity power factor, a fully reactive state is a negative unity power factor. That's why we call it negative, because it's away from normalcy. Normalcy is positive unity, and we can use it in our appliances. Negative unity, we can't use it to the worst degree possible. It can't get any worse than that. 90-degree deviation is not good enough. No, when it's 180, that's as worst as you can get. Because the electricity is being pulled apart at the seams. It's ready to fall apart into its constituent ingredients. Yet, if it doesn't, we can manipulate it instead of losing it altogether, which I suspect would happen if it did totally rip apart. But I don't know. I'm assuming. I don't really know that. But I do know it's manipulatable when it gets into 180-degree separation between current and voltage in an AC system. When there's a phase shift, so, for instance, a voltage inversion that would cause a phase shift to occur. That's my favorite way to create a phase shift. So in that condition of reactance, frequency is very manipulatable and will have a direct impact on power directly, not inversely. Unlike positive unity factor, in which frequency and power are inversely related, not directly related. This is kind of important because it kind of points out the structure of negative resistance or negative current. Negative resistance. That it's negative unity power factor, and that potential energy is directly equivalent to, not necessarily equal to, but directly equivalent to, proportionally speaking, to one degree or another, power. So that if you increase frequency, you increase power. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if you increase power, you increase frequency. I don't know. Maybe it's true. Maybe it works both ways. But at the very least, I've seen it with the frequency raises first, and then the power follows suit. But it could be they just happen at the same time, because in that state of negative unity power factor, they are one and the same. They are one and the same reality. And yet, reactance formulas never include power. They only talk about frequency. Now, maybe it's a sleight of hand by the engineers in charge of these laws in the form of mathematical equations, and they decided to hide the truth. They decided to hide the truth. They could have just as easily, if it's going to be directly related, they could have just as easily have said power instead of frequency, but they didn't. So to me, that sounds like sleight of hand. Bait and switch. Oh, it's just potential energy. Don't worry about it. And then everybody thinks, oh yeah, well, potential energy is inversely related to power. No, not when it's fully reacting. That's not the case. So, because when it's 90 degrees, it's useless. See, and that's the other thing. Electrical engineers are programmed and brainwashed to think that all reactance is useless, and that's not true. Only 90-degree reactance is useless. 180 degree is not, because 180 degree you can manipulate it by expanding or contracting its power level as well as its frequency. Isn't that amazing? So negative unity power factor is not useless. It's the wrong terminology for me to use that term. And when engineers say, oh, the 180 degree separation, negative unity power factor does not exist, now I can see why they say that. Because the word lossless or useless only pertains to 90 degree separation between current and voltage. It does not pertain to 180 degree separation because nobody practices it. So how can you apply a term to a situation you never encounter? Duh. Good grief. I am slow to figure out the machinations to the extent that engineers, electrical engineers, go to so much trouble to hide the truth in front of their own faces, let alone ours. So this way they can claim they're not lying to us because they're already lying to themselves. So much so, so frequently, that they've stopped noticing. That's called, isn't that the framework of an alcoholic? Denial? And isn't that how politicians work? So it shows how political electrical engineering has become, but also how commercial. And when you marry politics with commerce, that is the definition of fascism. Yet, we don't do it the same way the Nazis did it. So apparently there are different varieties of fascism. And we've got the kind that's more like the Catholic Church saying, or focusing more on what we cannot do instead of focusing on what we can do. Why is it that always the outlaw is the can-do person? You know, the rogue police officer, the rogue hero, Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones. He's the rogue hero who's making it up as he goes along. He has no idea what he's doing. He just does the best he can with what he's got. Isn't that what outlaws do? And isn't that what the Nazis did? They had no oil, access to oil fields. They were cut off from all importation of oil because they were surrounded by a bunch of hostile nations, kind of like the way Israel was surrounded by the Arabs. That's interesting. Talk about interesting juxtaposition of situations. But be that as it may, they had tons of coal, and they figured out how to convert coal into petroleum. And all of a sudden, voila, they have all this petroleum now. But they didn't at first, so they got inventive, and they got problem-solving oriented, troubleshooting oriented, in which to figure out problems and find out their solutions, and they didn't let a damn thing get in their way. Nothing stood in their way as far as they were concerned. People or ideologies or religion or morals or international courts of law, forget it. They're going to do whatever it takes to survive. Considering what they've been through during the first half of the 1900s, that sounds like a very reasonable attitude. It's a perfectly natural outgrowth of their circumstances. We don't like them for what they've done, but be that as it may, it's perfectly legitimate. It's very appreciable. Anywho, so they went and solved problems, and they were a can-do nation. We can do this. How do we do it? Instead of, no, you can't do it, and then that's it. You can't even think any further. Where do you go from no? You can't go anywhere. At least with a yes, you can then ask, okay, how yes? How, when yes? Why yes? You can ask all the questions you want to, provided you first say yes. But if you say no, you can't ask anything further. That's that. That's the end of that. End of discussion. Very repressive. We live in a very repressive world. I have to wonder why. I guess because we can afford to. That's right. We're wealthy. Isn't that what wealth affords those who are wealthy? The ability to say no. The ability to be repressive. And yet, Russia was extremely poor, and yet very repressive. Why? Because she was not poor. No, that's right. No, her problem has always been the problem of distribution, or lack thereof, in which only a few had all the wealth and everybody else had zip. And that's why it was repressive, because it takes wealth to exercise repression. You can't do it if you're poor. You're too weak. You're too hungry. All you can think about is the food you don't have. You can't worry about let's go wage a pogrom on some little shtetl over there and kill off a bunch of Jews. You wouldn't dream of it. You wouldn't even think of it. You'd be too busy wondering about, my God, I haven't eaten in 3 days. When am I going to eat? And what will it be? Will I gnaw on the tree bark? Only the wealthy can worry about repression. And that's what we do. We suppress. So I guess money does corrupt. Or no, that's not true. No, it merely exhibits corruption. Big difference. No, the corruption was already there to begin with. That's right. The corruption was already there to begin with. But if you're starving, who's going to notice? As soon as you get some money, then we'll find out who you really are. What really makes you tick? What really rocks your cradle? Because you were too busy scraping a living together to really get to exercise your freedom of motion. So now we get to find out once you get wealthy. Okay. So money never did corrupt. It just exhibits behavior we wouldn't have seen otherwise had you been poor all the time. Okay, so in our Western world, we have the suppressed version of physics and electrodynamics because we're wealthy and we can afford to be repressive. While anywhere else, hey, look at me. I was starving for 3-4 years, all because I wanted to get my son back. And the $1,000 allowance I used to get per month got removed so that I wouldn't be able to pay for an attorney or a private investigator to get my son back. And that really got my steam rolling in studying electrodynamic theory to understand free energy. Up until that point, I just kind of dabbled and babbled and speculated and didn't really know a damn and didn't care. But once I started caring that I was hungry all the time, oh boy, did I put myself into it full-fledged. And I figured it out. Now I get to eat. I still don't have enough money to do anything more than that because I'm just barely getting by. But at least now I can get to eat. But had I not been starving for about 3 years, I never would have bothered to work as hard as I did. I worked night and day. I worked oh my God. I won't say my tail off because that's a euphemism, a cliche. I worked my feet off to the point now I can't even walk without severe pain. Oh, did I abuse my feet sitting still all day long. My feet kept swelling up and I thought, I can handle this. They're just swollen. Now my feet are in pain and I can't walk, even though they're not swollen anymore. So I abused my feet. That was the cost I paid for it, along with starvation. But now I understand free energy because I understand energy. It's really no different. There's no difference between the two. Free energy is one and the same. For anybody to make a distinction shows they really don't know what they're talking about. And this is why electrical engineers don't like the term free energy. They think the term does not exist or it applies to something else. And they're just beating around the bush. Energy is energy, and it doesn't matter whether you call it free or not. I mean, you think Mother Nature gets charged? I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's like asking the Almighty Supreme Being, which of course who does not exist in science, a prayer, Oh, Almighty Father, send a Redeemer, we are suffering so much. And the Almighty says, can you hold that thought? I'll get back to you next week and I'll have an answer. I have to go confer with my associate over here. I have to go confer up the ladder, the chain of command, and see what they say. Because, you got me stumped here. I'm not sure how to solve your problem. How almighty can the Almighty be if they got to pause and think about it and go confer with someone? So, like that, how can energy not be free to the Almighty? Oh, well, they're almighty. Yeah. Who do you think you are? Trying to emulate. Even if what the Bible says may not be true, that we're not God, doesn't mean we don't try to be. Didn't the Nazis think they were gods? You know? Oh, we're the master race. We're going to take over the world with our perfect genes. And everybody else is going to be killed off. Isn't that a self-image of God? Wouldn't you say? Not that it's a false self-image, but it is false to abuse people on the basis of that. Because, well, no, wait a minute. Aren't the gypsies God? Aren't the homosexuals God? What about the Jews? What about the Turks wiping out the Armenians? Aren't Armenians gods? Just like the Turks are God? You know, I mean, if you specify one person as God, then everybody else has to be God. So you can't say, well, some people are more equal than others. You know, that famous expression. Where did they use that in a movie recently? It was very appropriate. I can't remember the movie. I remember The Planet of the Apes. Yeah, the original set of movies, one of the 5 or 6 movies that came out in the late 60s or early 70s, a black man said that, I think, to the apes. But apparently some gorillas are more equal than others. That's right. One of the gorillas was claiming he was superior to the chimpanzees or to the humans. And the black man, the humans, said, well, no, wait a minute, that sounds like the gorillas. Some gorillas are more equal than others, you know. Because they were claiming equality. The gorilla was claiming equality, and obviously he was claiming equality only among the gorillas. So, anyway. Wow. That's heavy duty. That's a lot of shit. Oh my God. So there's no limit to scale. Energy doesn't come from a place it cannot. It moves, that's true, but it's an infinitely long movement from larger to smaller, in which it does dissipate. The laws of thermodynamics do hold. The problem is the energy doesn't come from somewhere ultimately. It comes from nowhere and no when. Literally. And this goes back to an idea in, I forget what it's called, but it has to do with infinite sets in mathematics. And they are labeled with Aleph. And Aleph is basically their symbol for infinity, except with the stipulation that, unlike infinity, with Aleph, you know, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, you can put a subscript underneath it and give it an identity. So, for instance, all natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, on and on, that's one infinite set. So let's say that's Aleph sub natural numbers, subscript Q for natural numbers. And then you have Aleph P, subscript P, which are all odd natural numbers. And then you've got subscript R for all natural even numbers. Now, is the even set any different in size than the odd set? Is the natural numbers of both sets any different in size than either of the two sets, the odds or the evens? Aren't they both infinite? How can you say one is larger than the other? You can't. Magnitude has no identity when you're dealing with infinity, obviously. All you're dealing with is typology, identity. What type of infinity are we dealing with here? And that's literally what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the relative. Everything you see around you, the finger, is an infinity. But its type gives it limits. It's the typology of that infinity that gives it a shape of a hand. Yet it's still infinity. It's just infinity of a certain type. A hand versus a foot. Two different types, which are different. And a thumb, bigger than a pinky. Yet, that's simply a type of infinity. It's still infinity. And so, the energy that we have in the universe comes from infinity. it goes to infinity. And for all intents and purposes, it still is infinity. It's just we make a distinction. Oh, it's got so many amperes and so many volts. Yeah, but it's still infinity. And this is why the mathematical laws of reactance never talk about amplitude. Probably for a good reason, not to hide the truth so much as not to confuse us with the reality of the situation is that everything we see is made up of infinity, masquerading as being bounded by boundaries and shape and defined characteristics, when in reality it's infinity. And because electrical reactance formulas allows for the modification of amplitude, of power, via this little sleight of hand of the modification of frequency, namely the modification of kinetic energy via the sleight of hand of modification of potential energy, it's pretty obvious that we are playing with energy. We're not creating energy and we're not destroying energy. We're expanding and contracting. It's no different than Christ performing the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. And he says, bring me all you have. So they bring him 3 loaves and 4 fishes. And he magnifies that to 1,000 loaves and 2,000 fishes or whatever, and feeds the multitudes. From those scanty quantity in the beginning became a voluminous quantity of food. Where did all the food come from? It came from the original 3 loaves and 4 fishes or whatever. So it didn't come out of nothing necessarily. The energy was already there to begin with. And so in a sense, it's not that it comes from nowhere or no when. It just comes from the pre-existing energy. And matter comes from the pre-existing matter. And matter disappears back into the already existent matter. In other words, not all of it disappears, nor can it. There will never be a time when matter does not exist. There will never be a time when energy does not exist. There always was a time when energy existed. There always was a time when matter existed. As to its typology, that's a whole other story, which is the eternity of creation to describe the constant variations. But be that as it may, there never was a time when all of this was not in its ultimate substance. It just keeps changing. And that's about the only thing you can say, is that it keeps changing. But to say that, oh, but we have to have energy in equals energy out, that's requiring the accountability that the Federal Reserve banking system requires of all of its member banks. Every midnight, all the books got to tally up and come out to be zero. Because all of the assets have to be counterpoised against all of the liabilities perfectly, or else the banker who owns his bank has to make up the difference out of his own pocket one way or another. Either he gains or he loses out of his own pocket or back into his own pocket. But his books have to come out to be zero or he loses his license for owning his bank. He has to pay a lot of money to buy the license, and he has to follow the rules. And one of the rules is every midnight it's called double column, I believe it's called double column accounting, in which one column he lists all his assets, the next column right beside it he lists all his liabilities, and they have to zero out at the bottom of that 2 columns. They have to neutralize each other at the end of each business day, which is midnight. Because there is no money in circulation, and it has to stay that way. No value in circulation. It has to stay that way. The United States Treasury went bankrupt in 1920. It was reorganized in 1921 on this basis. So it's really a restriction based on them that we have the physics that we have and the electrodynamics that we have. That's the only reason why we have this, because everything has to be accounted for. Yet, if there's no limit to scale, physical scale in the universe, either large or small, there's no way any of us could be omniscient enough to account for everything. It's impossible. It's impossible. So we don't really go there. I don't see anybody talking about scale, but I think it's pretty much a given that everybody just assumes there's a limit to size in terms of bigness and in terms of smallness. Democritus said, oh, the atom is the unit. We cannot divide any further. And now physics says, well, yeah, but there's subatomic particles, and so far we've counted about 40 or whatever. No, it don't work that way. Yeah, so far, see? They hedge themselves. Oh, they're such good politicians. They hedge themselves. So far, we've only counted X number of subatomic particles and waves and characteristics and, you know, whatever they want to call it these days, you know. They have such bizarre names. But they hedge themselves. They never say, oh, we know how many there are, what the limit is. No, this is how many we have so far, which is kind of, you know, we never bothered to think that through, you and I, the common person, and say to ourselves, you know what that sounds like? They don't know what the limit is to smallness, which means there can't be a limit to bigness, which means there cannot be accountability. It's impossible. And so why are they saying energy in has to equal energy out when they can't even keep the book straight? It's impossible. If you don't know the limits of scale, there's no way you can account for all of the energy in the universe, because you're not going to be able to account for all the matter either. Hello? How much does it take to figure that one out? I mean, good God. Talk about simplicity. A 4-year-old could guess that one. Duh, let me see. And they don't even have to be smart. They can be a dummy, and they'll still figure it out. Oh, sometimes I wonder what world I live in. I have a heart, and my heart tells me what I know is true before I know how to explain it to my own satisfaction. It doesn't mean I've convinced you in the course of this video, but I certainly have convinced myself without a doubt, without refutation, without further qualification. Energy in cannot equal energy out, because we can't account for it all, because there's no limit to scale. There's no boundary to physical scale. Period. There just isn't any. There cannot be. But it's all because of the Federal Reserve and the bankruptcy of our national treasury 100 years ago this year. 100 years ago this year. That is the only reason why we have the shape of physics and electrodynamics that we have today. There you go. On the 100th birth year of that flawed style of thinking. Don't you think it's time for a change? I do. Duh. What's that song from the 70s or 60s? You know, if revolution should come, let it begin with me. Or, you know, if some change should occur, you know, where you start acting nice to one another, shouldn't it start with me? Not revolution, no. Change for the better. I think that was the song. I can't remember, you know. It was one of these Joan Baez songs. Baez, you know, one of these touchy-feely, very nice, make you feel good songs of the tail end of the Vietnam War era, to make you start to try to get people to, you know, feel good about themselves despite the shit that was going on. Well, you would think after 100 years of lying to ourselves, it's about time we stop lying. I would say so.